A man walks under a sun that shows no mercy. Behind him, a line of people stretches as far as the eye can see. Men, women, children, the elderly, all moving in the same direction, all trusting the same promise. It was supposed to take 11 days, just 11, but something happened along that road, something that changed everything, and something most people have never heard explained to the end. Because what should have been a journey of just over a week turned into 40 years. 40 years of waiting, of sand, of silence. And the most common explanation, that it was simply a punishment, is true but incomplete. There's a layer beneath that explanation that few documentaries dare to show. And it begins with a simple question. What would you do if your freedom arrived suddenly and you had no idea what to do with it? This story is among the most discussed and at the same time most misunderstood biblical mysteries in all of Scripture. A people who watched the sea split open, who ate bread falling from the sky every single morning without exception for 40 decades. And yet, within just weeks of freedom, that same people were already ready to go back to the chains they had escaped. How is that possible? And what does it reveal about how the human mind handles the unknown? Throughout this documentary, we'll go back to the beginning, to the exact moment everything started to unravel, and uncover the hidden truths behind one of the most devastating decisions ever recorded in the history of a people. Some see this as nothing more than an ancient punishment. Others see one of the most relevant signs of the times for today, a silent pattern that repeats in the life of anyone who has ever waited too long for something that seemed like it would never come. And the answer to why might be closer to you than it seems.
For 400 years, a nation lived inside walls of mud brick and fear. Israel was not a guest in Egypt, they were property. Sunrise meant labor, and labor meant pain that never fully healed before the next day's work began. Generations were born into chains, lived inside chains, and were buried still wearing them. Then came an order from Pharaoh that still feels impossible to read aloud. Every newborn Hebrew son was to be thrown into the Nile, not enslaved, erased. This is where our story begins, not with a miracle, but with a wound so deep it would take far longer to heal than anyone could imagine. Historians and theologians have studied this period for centuries, but there's a detail most documentaries skip entirely. The trauma of those 4 centuries didn't just shape bodies, it shaped minds. It rewired how an entire people would see God, see freedom, and see themselves long after the chains were gone. Some believe this single fact explains everything that happens next, and if that's true, then the real story of Israel's wilderness years didn't start in the desert at all. It started here, in the brick pits of Egypt, decades before anyone knew a desert was coming. Into this darkness, a child was placed in a basket on the Nile, the very river meant to kill him. Found by Pharaoh's own daughter, raised inside the palace of the empire that enslaved his people, Moses lived 2 lives at once. Then, after killing an Egyptian overseer, he fled into the wilderness, the same wilderness that would later define the rest of his life. For decades, he disappeared, a fugitive shepherd in a foreign land. Then came the moment that changed everything. A bush that burned but was never consumed. A voice from inside the fire said something no one in Egypt had heard in 400 years. I have seen the suffering of my people. I have heard their cry. I know their pain. Not, I will eventually act. Not, I have a plan for later. I know. I have seen. This is one of the quiet, hidden truths of the entire account. Before any plague, before any miracle, the story begins with a God who claims to have been paying attention the whole time, even during the silence that felt like abandonment. What followed has been called one of the most devastating sequences of events in ancient history. 10 plagues fell on Egypt, one after another, each one escalating, each one striking at something Egypt worshipped. The Nile, a source of life and a god to the Egyptians, turned to blood. Frogs, lice, flies, disease swept through livestock and crops. Darkness covered the land for 3 full days, a darkness so complete that some accounts describe people unable to leave their homes. And then came the final plague, the death of every firstborn son in Egypt in a single night. Pharaoh, the man who once ordered Hebrew infants drowned, now buried his own child. Some scholars have noted the symmetry is almost too precise to be coincidence. The same kind of loss Pharaoh inflicted returned to his own house. Whether you read this as cosmic justice, divine judgment, or something else entirely, one thing is clear. By morning, the most powerful empire on earth was broken, and Pharaoh said the words no one believed they would ever hear: "Go."
That night has been remembered for thousands of years as the night everything changed. Israel left Egypt, not as refugees sneaking away in shame, but carrying gold and silver given to them by the very people who had enslaved them. They walked out under what can only be described as the protection of something far beyond Pharaoh's reach. For the first time in 4 centuries, an entire nation took a step as free people. It should have been the end of the story. A people freed from slavery, walking toward a land promised to their ancestors generations earlier, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. By every measure, the hardest part was over. But there is something rarely discussed in the retelling of this night, something that changes the entire meaning of what comes next. Israel walked out of Egypt in a single evening, but Egypt did not walk out of them. Not that night, not that year, not for a very, very long time. And understanding why is the key to everything that follows in this story. Just days later, the first test arrived, and it revealed something unsettling almost immediately. Pharaoh changed his mind. 600 of Egypt's finest war chariots, along with cavalry and infantry, were sent thundering across the desert after the people he had just released. Israel found themselves camped at the edge of the Red Sea, water in front of them, the most feared military force in the ancient world closing in from behind. They were trapped. And in that moment, with freedom only days old, the people said something that should stop anyone in their tracks. Was it not better to serve the Egyptians than to die here in the wilderness? Think about the timeline. Days, not years. Days of freedom, and already the chains of Egypt began to look better than the uncertainty of the unknown. This is one of the most quietly devastating lines in the entire account. And some historians argue it is the single most important sentence in understanding everything that happens over the next 40 years. What happened next has become one of the most iconic images in religious history, but the part almost no one talks about is what happened to the path behind them. Moses lifted his staff. A powerful east wind roared through the night, and by morning the sea had split into 2 walls of water with dry ground between them. An entire nation walked through on dry land. Men, women, children, the elderly, livestock, all of it. When Pharaoh's army followed, the waters returned, and in minutes the most feared military force on the planet ceased to exist. Israel erupted into celebration, songs, dancing, a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. But here is what is rarely discussed. When those waters crashed down, they didn't just destroy an army, they sealed off the only road back to Egypt permanently. There was now, physically, no way to return. And yet, and this is where our story truly begins, even with the door locked forever, the next 40 years would become a battle over a place that technically no longer even existed.
3 days. That's how long the celebration lasted. 3 days after watching an entire sea split in 2, after witnessing the destruction of the most powerful army on earth, the people arrived at a place called Mara and found water that was undrinkable, bitter, unsafe, and immediately they turned on Moses. No prayer, no request, just complaint. What are we going to drink? Think about what just happened days earlier. The same man standing in front of them had just parted an ocean. Surely this smaller problem could be solved. But instead of trust, there was only accusation. God responded not with anger, but with provision. A piece of wood was thrown into the water and it became drinkable. Crisis solved. Lesson offered. But here is the question this story keeps circling back to again and again. Was the lesson learned? Some believe this single moment at Mara is the first sign of a pattern that would define this entire generation. And if you watch closely, you'll start to see it everywhere. About 6 weeks later, the complaints returned, this time about food, and the words used are almost shocking in their intensity. If only we had died in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. You have brought us into this desert to starve us to death. Pay close attention to what is happening here. These were slaves. Slaves do not sit around pots of meat. They do not eat all the bread they want. And yet, only weeks removed from chains, beatings, and the murder of their own children by royal decree, they were now describing Egypt as a place of comfort and abundance. This is one of the most important hidden truths in the entire account, and it has almost nothing to do with ancient history. The human mind has an extraordinary capacity to rewrite the past when the present becomes uncomfortable. What if the chains they were mourning were never as golden as their memory now claimed? And what does that say about the chains we romanticize in our own lives? God's response to this moment is where the story takes its first truly strange turn. Instead of judgment, birds, quail covered the camp that evening, and the next morning the ground was covered in something no one had ever seen before. Thin, white, flaky, sweet like wafers made with honey. What is it, the people asked, and that question became its name, manna, bread from heaven. But here is the detail almost no one focuses on. This wasn't a one-time miracle. This happened every single morning for 40 years without exception. Each family could gather only enough for that day. If anyone tried to hoard extra for tomorrow, it spoiled overnight, filled with worms. Gather too much, and you'd end up with exactly what you needed anyway. Gather too little, and somehow there was still enough. This wasn't just food. This was a daily test, one that could never be passed in advance, never stored up, never taken for granted. Every single morning, for 14,600 days, the test repeated itself.
Centuries later, Moses explained what this daily bread was really teaching. In Deuteronomy, he wrote that God allowed them to hunger, then fed them with manna, to teach them that people do not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. Consider what was actually happening here. In Egypt, bread came from Pharaoh. You earned it, you worked for it. Your survival depended on a human master. In the wilderness, bread came from the sky. You couldn't earn it, you couldn't buy it. You woke up and it was simply there. Some scholars describe this as a complete reprogramming of an entire nation's understanding of provision, dismantling, piece by piece, the slave economy that had been burned into their minds for 400 years and replacing it with something they had never experienced before. Not a wage, a gift, renewed every single morning, whether they deserved it or not. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What would it take for you to trust a gift you couldn't control or store? 3 months after leaving Egypt, the people arrived at the foot of a mountain called Sinai, and what happened there would become one of the most studied, debated, and re-examined events in religious history. The mountain shook. Smoke rose from its peak like a furnace. The sound of a trumpet with no human source grew louder and louder until the entire camp trembled, and then a voice, not a whisper, not a vision, a voice, audible to an entire nation, delivering what we now call the 10 Commandments. But notice how it begins, not with a demand, with a memory. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Grace first, law second. Rescue first, response second. This order is rarely highlighted, but some argue it is the entire key to understanding the relationship being described here. Not obey me so I will save you, but I have already saved you. Now here is how to live as someone who is free. Moses then went up the mountain to receive detailed instructions, and he stayed there for 40 days. 40 days of silence from the people's perspective, and in that silence, something began to unravel. The people approached Aaron, Moses' own brother, the man who would become high priest, and said words that should stop anyone reading this in their tracks. "Make us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." And Aaron, in what may be the single most consequential leadership failure recorded in this entire story, collected gold jewelry from the people and melted it into a golden calf, an idol. And the people danced around it, declaring, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." Stop and sit with that for a moment. The smoke from God's presence was still visible on the mountain above them.
This is the moment, right here, where the story shifts from history into something far more personal and far more uncomfortable. These were people who had seen 10 plagues with their own eyes, who had walked through a sea on dry ground, who ate bread from the sky every single morning. And in 6 weeks, they melted their jewelry into a statue of a calf, an image borrowed directly from the gods of the empire that had enslaved them. This single moment destroys one of our most deeply held assumptions, that if people just saw enough proof, they would believe, that if they witnessed enough miracles, they would remain faithful. The evidence says otherwise. You can watch a sea split open on Monday and build an idol by Tuesday, because the problem was never a lack of proof, it was something deeper. And before we go any further into what that something actually was, if you're still with us, comment the word desert below, just so we know you're still watching, because what comes next changes the entire meaning of everything you've just heard. 2 years. That's how long it took Israel to travel from Egypt to the southern border of the land they had been promised, the land of Canaan. 2 years after a journey that by distance alone should have taken less than 2 weeks. They stood at a place called Kadesh Barnea, and for the first time, the Promised Land wasn't a story their ancestors told. It was visible. It was real. Moses selected 12 men, one from each tribe, and sent them into Canaan to scout the land ahead. They were gone for 40 days, and that number, 40, would soon return to haunt this entire story in a way no one could have predicted. What these 12 spies brought back, and more importantly, how they chose to describe it, would determine the fate of an entire generation. Some believe this single moment, not the plagues, not the sea, not even the golden calf, is the true turning point of the whole 40-year story. And once you understand why, you may never read this account the same way again. When the 12 spies returned, they carried physical proof of what they had seen. A single cluster of grapes so large it required 2 men to carry it on a pole between them. Pomegranates, figs. For a people who had eaten nothing but manna for 2 years, this wasn't just food, it was evidence. Proof that the Promised Land wasn't a myth passed down through generations. It was real, it was fertile, and it was within reach. The land truly flows with milk and honey, they reported. Every single one of the 12 agreed on this. There was no debate about the facts. But then came a single word that would unravel everything. However, the people who live there are powerful. The cities are fortified, and we saw giants, descendants of Anak. Here is what's critical to notice. All 12 spies saw the exact same land, the same grapes, the same fertile soil, the same giants. The facts were never in question. What was about to divide this nation wasn't what they saw, it was how they chose to interpret it. 10 of the 12 spies saw this evidence and saw only defeat. 2 looked at the exact same evidence and saw victory. And then came a sentence that reveals something far deeper than military strategy, something almost nobody expects to find buried inside this story. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Read that again. This wasn't a tactical assessment. This was a confession. After everything, the plagues, the sea, the bread from heaven, the mountain that shook, these people looked at themselves and saw insects. 400 years of slavery had convinced an entire generation that they were nothing, and not even the miracles of the last 2 years had been enough to undo it. This is one of the most overlooked hidden truths in Scripture. The 10 spies didn't say the giants are too strong for God. They said we are too small. And no amount of evidence, it seems, can repair an identity that's been broken for 4 centuries, at least not on its own. Only 2 men saw it differently. Joshua and a man named Caleb, whose story becomes far more important later. The land is exceedingly good, they said. "If the Lord is pleased with us, he will give it to us. Do not be afraid." And how did the people respond to the only two men telling them the truth? They wanted to stone them. They wanted to kill the two people offering hope, and instead they said something that should have been impossible after everything they had witnessed. "Let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt." Read that sentence slowly. Back to Egypt, after the plagues, after the sea, after the manna, after the voice on the mountain. They wanted to elect a new leader and march willingly back into the chains they had been rescued from. And it was at this exact moment that something shifted, not in the people, but in the response from above. "How long will these people treat me with contempt?" the voice said. "How long will they refuse to believe in me despite all the signs I have performed among them?" What came next has been called one of the most devastating verdicts in the entire account, and the symmetry of it is almost too precise to be accidental. None of the adults who had seen these signs, who had witnessed this much and still refused to trust, would ever see the Promised Land. Their bodies would fall in this wilderness, and their children, the next generation, would wander for 40 years. 1 year for each of the 40 days the spies had spent exploring the land. 40 days of doubt became 40 years of consequence. Some call this poetic justice. Others call it something closer to a forced reset, an entire culture given exactly the amount of time it needed to die out, generation by generation, before something new could be built in its place. But the question this story keeps circling back to is this: was this really only about punishment, or was something else happening here? Something far more complicated and far more relevant to anyone watching this today. Here's what's almost never discussed when this story is told. The surface explanation, God punished disobedience, is true, but it's incomplete. There are layers underneath that explanation that change everything. The first layer is what we've already uncovered, an identity crisis so deep that an entire generation could not picture themselves as anything other than victims, no matter how many miracles they witnessed. The second layer is even more uncomfortable. Their failure wasn't ignorance. They weren't punished for not knowing God. They were punished for knowing Him, for seeing His power with their own eyes repeatedly and still choosing not to trust Him. What if the most dangerous kind of disbelief isn't the disbelief of someone who has never encountered something greater than themselves, but the disbelief of someone who has encountered it again and again and still can't bring themselves to trust it? And there's a third layer, one that completely reframes the entire judgment. What if this wasn't only punishment? What if it was protection? A nation of former slaves, psychologically broken, spiritually unprepared, sent directly into war against hardened warriors. That isn't conquest. That's a massacre waiting to happen. They would have panicked at the first resistance, surrendered at the first setback. Some believe the 40 years weren't a sentence handed down in anger, but a barrier placed between a broken people and a battle they were not yet capable of surviving. Sometimes what looks like rejection is actually protection, and sometimes what looks like a delay is actually preparation for something that hasn't happened yet. But to understand what that preparation actually looked like, what really happened during those 40 years, we have to go somewhere most retellings of this story skip entirely.
Most people imagine the next 40 years as a blank space, an empty stretch of nothing, a punishment served out in silence, as if everything simply paused while an entire generation waited to die. But that image is almost the exact opposite of what the historical account describes. There is one detail that completely reframes everything. A column of cloud never left. Every single day, for 40 years, a visible manifestation hovered over the camp. By day, it shielded them from a sun so intense it could kill. By night, it became fire, lighting the darkness. When the cloud moved, the people moved. When it stopped, they stopped. Every morning, anyone in that camp could simply look up and see proof, visible, undeniable proof that whatever they believed was happening, abandonment wasn't it. This is one of the most quietly powerful hidden truths in the entire account. 40 years of what looks on the surface like silence was actually 40 years of a presence that never once looked away. And the manna never stopped either. For 40 years, 14,600 mornings, bread appeared on the ground of a desert where nothing grows. Estimates of the camp's size range from hundreds of thousands to well over 1 million people. Think about the logistics alone. Feeding a population the size of a major modern city every single day in a landscape that could not naturally support even a fraction of that number. This wasn't a small group of nomads camping under the stars. This was one of the largest organized populations in the ancient world, sustained entirely by something that, by every natural law, should not have been possible. And here is a detail that almost never makes it into the retelling. According to the account in Deuteronomy, their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell for 40 years. Sandals that lasted 4 decades in a desert, robes that never tore. Every single day, without anyone noticing, they were wearing a miracle. But this wasn't a peaceful 40 years either, and some of what happened during this time is rarely discussed because of how disturbing it is. There was the rebellion of Korah, 250 leaders who challenged Moses' authority, and the ground itself opened and swallowed them. There were venomous snakes sent into the camp after yet another wave of complaints, though even here a remedy was provided. A bronze serpent lifted on a pole that healed anyone who simply looked at it. Centuries later, a man from Nazareth would point to that exact image and compare it to his own coming death. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. What if this strange, unsettling detail from deep in the wilderness was never just about snakes at all, but a signpost pointing towards something that wouldn't happen for over 1,000 years?
Then came the moment that broke even Moses. At a place called Meribah, the people demanded water again. God told Moses to speak to a rock. Instead, in a moment of exhaustion and fury, Moses struck the rock with his staff, shouting at the people in anger. Water came out. The crisis was solved, but the consequence was unlike anything that had come before. Because you did not trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, the verdict came, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. Moses, the man who stood before Pharaoh, who spoke to God face to face on a mountain that shook, who had interceded for this people more times than could be counted, would not enter the promised land either. One moment of misdirected anger, and the greatest leader in this entire account lost the right to finish what he started. If leadership comes with greater grace, it seems it also comes with far less room for error. Year by year, the old generation disappeared, buried one by one in the sand of the wilderness, exactly as it had been spoken at Kadesh Barnea. And as they disappeared, something else was quietly happening, almost unnoticed. Their children, born in tents, raised on manna, knowing no life except the desert and the God who sustained it, were growing into adults. But these adults were fundamentally different from their parents. They had no memory of Egypt, no nostalgia for Pharaoh's table, no inner voice whispering that slavery had been safer. They had grown up watching a cloud move ahead of them every single day. They had grown up gathering bread from the sky every single morning. They had grown up knowing in their bones that every breath came from somewhere beyond themselves. This had been the strategy from the very beginning. An old mindset, forged over 400 years of slavery, could not simply be erased from the parents, but an entirely new one could be built from nothing in the children. And it was. Then there is Caleb, and his story may be the most quietly remarkable detail in this entire account. He was one of the 2 spies who, decades earlier, said, "We can do this." For that, his life was spared. But Caleb still had to walk the same 40 years as everyone else, watching his entire generation die around him, one by one, year after year, while he waited. When the conquest of the Promised Land finally began, Caleb was 85 years old. Most people that age are looking for rest. Caleb went to Joshua and asked for a mountain. Not a valley, not flat, already cleared land, the mountain. The exact territory where the giants lived, the same giants that had terrified the other spies 40 years earlier.
I am still as strong today as I was the day Moses sent me, he said. 40 years in the wilderness didn't weaken Caleb, they forged him. Same desert, same years, a completely different result. Because the difference was never the wilderness, it was what was happening inside the person walking through it.
There is one final image from this story that almost never gets the attention it deserves. 40 years after leaving Egypt, Moses stood on the plains of Moab, 120 years old, looking across a river at a land he had spent his entire life walking toward. The generation that left Egypt was gone, every one of them buried in the wilderness exactly as foretold. In front of Moses now stood a new people, hardened by the desert, shaped by dependence on something greater than themselves. Ready. Moses delivered his final words, an entire speech recounting everything: the plagues, the sea, the manna, the golden calf, Kadesh Barnea, the 40 years. And then God did something almost unbearable to read. He took Moses to the top of Mount Nebo and showed him the entire promised land, every region, every valley, the whole landscape laid out like a painting. Moses could see all of it, every single thing he had worked for, suffered for, believed in for 40 years, visible, in full, stretching out before him. And he could not enter it. The text is specific about something strange. Moses' eyes were not weak, and his strength had not failed. He wasn't dying of age or illness. He was as strong as he had ever been. But it was time, and Moses obeyed, one final time. He died there, on the mountain, with the promised land filling his vision, and was buried in a location no one has ever found, as if something wanted to make absolutely sure that this one, at least, belonged to no one else. Leadership passed to Joshua, one of the two spies who, 40 years earlier, had said, "We can do this," and had been ready to die for saying it. When Joshua led the new generation to the Jordan River, it split open, just as the Red Sea had 40 years before. But this time, they didn't look back, and the manna, bread that had fallen from the sky every single morning for 14,600 days, simply stopped, without warning, without ceremony, because for the first time in 40 years, they didn't need it anymore. So here is the question this entire story leaves behind, and it's not really a question about ancient history at all. The distance between an 11-day journey and a 40-year sentence was never about geography. It was never about the size of the giants or the strength of the armies or even the harshness of the desert. Every single person who left Egypt walked through the same sea. Every single person ate the same bread from heaven every single morning for as long as they lived. The cloud moved over all of them equally. And yet, some of them died in the wilderness surrounded by miracles they had stopped believing in. And others, like Caleb, walked out of that same wilderness stronger than they walked in. What if the desert was never the problem, and never the punishment either? What if it was simply the place where the truth about a person or a generation eventually comes to the surface? Some say the wilderness is where faith dies, but what if for some it's the only place faith was ever actually given the chance to grow? This is one of the signs of the times worth sitting with, not as ancient history, but as a mirror. The bread is still falling. The cloud hasn't moved. The only open question is what each person standing underneath it chooses to see. Subscribe to the Hidden Scrolls for more hidden truths, because some of the most important biblical mysteries were never really about the past at all.